The gunshot that was supposed to be a wedding toast still rang in Maria Grayson's ears as she tore through the back alley behind the Whitfield saloon, her ivory wedding dress hiked up past her knees, and her heart slamming against her ribs like a fist against a cell door. It was the spring of 1878, in the dusty cattle town of Willow Creek, Colorado Territory, and Maria Grayson had just done the one thing no woman in that town had ever dared to do in front of 200 witnesses. She had run from her own wedding. Behind her, she could still hear the commotion spilling out of the church doors, the shouts of her intended groom, Silas Whitfield, echoing over the murmur of a stunned congregation. She did not look back. She could not afford to. Her lungs burned, her satin slippers were already shredded from the gravel, and somewhere behind her a man's voice was bellowing her name like a curse. Maria, Maria Grayson, you get back here. She had never hated the sound of her own name so much in her life. She ducked between two buildings, knocking over a barrel of nails that clattered and rolled across the packed dirt street, and kept running until her chest felt as though it might burst. The town of Willow Creek was not large, not the way Denver or Cheyenne were large, but it was large enough that a woman in a wedding gown could disappear for a few precious minutes if she was clever about where she went. And Maria Grayson, whatever else she might have been in that moment, frightened, humiliated, furious, was clever. She saw the sign swinging on its rusted chain above a low, wide building near the edge of the main street. Mercer, Blacksmith, and Farrier. It read in faded black letters, and beneath it, smoke curled up steady and gray from a chimney that never seemed to stop working. It was the busiest, loudest, most exposed building in the entire town, situated right on the main thoroughfare where anyone riding in or out would pass it twice over. It was, by every reasonable measure, the worst possible place to hide, which was exactly why Maria Grayson ran straight for it. She slipped through the open double doors just as she heard hooves thundering down the street behind her, men shouting, someone firing a pistol into the air to draw attention. The heat inside the forge hit her like a wall, thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, and for one terrible moment she thought there would be nowhere to go, nowhere to hide in a building with doors flung wide open to the entire town. Then she saw him. A tall man stood at the anvil with his back to her, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a leather apron dark with soot covering a homespun shirt that clung to broad shoulders slick with sweat. He was hammering a horseshoe into shape with steady, practiced blows, each strike ringing out like a church bell, utterly unaware that a bride in torn white satin had just stumbled into his shop. Maria did not have time to explain herself. She did not have time to be polite. She grabbed the edge of a canvas tarp draped over a stack of unfinished ironwork near the back wall and pulled it over herself, crouching low behind a barrel of scrap metal, praying that the darkness of the shop's rear corner and the chaos of noise would be enough. The hammering stopped. "Who's back there?" The voice was deep, wary, but not unkind. Owen Mercer set down his hammer and turned, wiping his brow with the back of one blackened hand, his sharp gray eyes narrowing at the lump of canvas that had most certainly not been there 5 minutes ago. Maria held her breath. Outside she heard boots pounding past the open doors, voices calling out, "Check the livery, check the mercantile." She couldn't have gotten far, not in that dress. The voices faded as the search moved further down the street, and only then did Maria dare to breathe again. Owen Mercer walked slowly toward the tarp, his boots crunching over scattered nails and coal dust. He was not a man given to being easily startled, not after 8 years of working iron in a town that saw its share of trouble, but there was something about the way that canvas trembled that told him whatever was under there was frightened half out of its wits. "I know you're under there," he said quietly. "Ain't going to hurt you, but you might as well come out before you suffocate." For a long moment nothing happened. Then slowly the canvas slid back and Owen Mercer found himself staring down at a young woman with dark hair falling loose from its pins, a face streaked with dust and tears, and a wedding dress that looked like it had been dragged through half the alleys in Willow Creek. "Well," he said, after a long pause, setting one hand on his hip, That explains the ruckus outside." Maria Grayson looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, and for a moment neither of them said a word. Outside, the shouts of the search party grew fainter, moving further down the main street toward the train depot, and the only sound in the blacksmith shop was the crackle of the forge fire and the ragged sound of her own breathing. "Please," she finally whispered, "please don't tell them I'm here." Owen Mercer studied her for a long moment, his jaw working the way it did when he was turning something over in his mind, weighing it like he might weigh a piece of iron before deciding whether it was fit to be shaped into something useful. "You're the Grayson girl," he said slowly. "The one that was supposed to marry Whitfield today." Maria's chin lifted, some of the fear in her eyes hardening into something closer to defiance. "I was supposed to marry him. I did not agree to it. My father agreed to it on my behalf because he owes that man more money than he will ever be able to repay." Owen let out a low breath through his nose, something between a huff and a laugh, though there was no humor in it. He had heard the talk around town, the way old Thomas Grayson had gambled away most of his cattle ranch over the past 2 years, first to bad luck, then to worse company, and how Silas Whitfield had been only too happy to hold the notes on that debt. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Silas Whitfield did not lend money out of kindness. He lent it the way a spider spins silk, patient and calculating, waiting for the moment he could collect on more than just money. "And you decided today was the day to run," Owen said. "I decided today was the only day I could," Maria answered, and something in her voice cracked despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "If I waited even one more hour, I would have been his wife. I would have belonged to him the way that anvil belongs to you." Owen glanced at the anvil, worn smooth and dark from years of use, and something about the comparison struck him harder than he expected. He looked back at Maria, at the torn hem of her dress, the bruise forming along one forearm where she must have struck the wall of the alley in her flight, and made a decision that would change the course of both their lives, though he did not know it yet. "Get up," he said, extending a soot-stained hand toward her. "Can't have you hiding behind a scrap barrel all day. Somebody's bound to come looking in here eventually, and when they do, we need a better story than a bride hiding under a canvas." Maria stared at his hand for a moment before taking it, her fingers small and trembling against his calloused palm as he helped her to her feet. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." Owen considered that question for a long moment, the way he considered most things, slow and deliberate. "Because I know Silas Whitfield," he said finally, "and I know what kind of man buys himself a wife instead of courting one honest and fair. That's reason enough for me." Outside, the church bell tolled once twice, a hollow and mournful sound in the afternoon heat, as though even the town itself mourned the wedding that would not be. The first thing Owen Mercer did was pull the double doors of the smithy nearly closed, leaving only a narrow gap for light and air, an unusual sight for a shop that always stood open from sunrise to sundown. He then disappeared into the back room, a small space behind the forge where he kept his ledgers, his tools, and a narrow cot he sometimes slept on during the coldest months when walking home to his cabin outside of town seemed like more trouble than it was worth. He returned a few minutes later with a bundle of clothes, plain and worn, the kind a young ranch hand might wear. "These belonged to my apprentice before he moved on to Cheyenne last winter. Ought to fit you close enough. You cannot walk around Willow Creek in a wedding dress, not with half the town looking for exactly that." Maria took the bundle with hands that still trembled slightly, though whether from fear or the sheer strangeness of the last half hour she could not say. "You want me to dress as a boy. I want you to not get caught," Owen said simply. "There's a difference between hiding and disappearing. You hide, and eventually somebody finds you. You disappear, and folks stop looking because there's nothing left that looks like what they're searching for." There was a wisdom in his words that surprised her, a practicality born, she would later learn, from years of surviving in a town that did not forgive weakness easily. She retreated behind the canvas curtain that separated the back room from the main forge, and changed as quickly as her shaking hands would allow, emerging several minutes later in trousers rolled up at the ankle, a loose shirt that smelled faintly of hay and leather, and a wide-brimmed hat that she pulled low over her face. Owen studied her for a long moment, then reached for a rag blackened with soot and reached toward her cheek before hesitating. "May I?" he asked. Maria nodded, and he smeared a careful streak of coal dust across her jaw and cheekbones, dulling the fineness of her features just enough that a passing glance would see only a dirty-faced boy working the bellows rather than the missing bride of Silas Whitfield. "There," he said, stepping back to examine his work. "You'll do. Name?" "Maria." "No," Owen said, almost smiling despite the gravity of the situation. "You need a boy's name, something plain." She thought for a moment, her mind still racing with fear and the strange giddiness of having escaped a fate she had dreaded for weeks. "Maddie," she said finally. "My mother used to call me that when I was small." "Maddie," Owen repeated, testing the name. "All right then, Maddie. Grab that bellows and try to look like you've done this before." And so it was that, when Sheriff Boone Hartley finally made his way down to the Mercer smithy nearly an hour later, following up on every business along the main street in his search for the missing bride, he found only Owen Mercer hammering out a new set of horseshoes while a soot-faced young hired hand worked the bellows beside him, both of them so thoroughly unremarkable that the sheriff barely spared them a second glance. "Owen," Sheriff Hartley said, tipping his hat as he paused in the doorway. "You seen a woman come through here?" Bride ran off from her own wedding not 2 hours past. Whitfield's near out of his mind about it. Owen did not look up from his work, striking the horseshoe with a measured blow before answering. "Ain't seen anybody but the customers who came in for their horses, Boone. Been busy all afternoon. New hand here's been keeping me on my toes." The sheriff glanced toward Maria, who kept her head down and her hat brim lower still, pumping the bellows with what she hoped looked like practiced indifference rather than the terror actually coursing through her veins. "That's so," Hartley said slowly. He was not a stupid man, and something about the tension in the shop nagged at the edges of his mind, but he had 6 other businesses to check before dark, and Silas Whitfield's men were already tearing apart the train depot 2 streets over. "Well, you hear anything, you send word up to my office." "Will do," Owen said, and the sheriff was gone, his boots crunching away down the dusty street toward the Mercantile. Only when the sound of his footsteps had faded entirely did Maria let out the breath she had been holding, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. Owen caught her elbow before she could sink to the floor, steadying her against the workbench. "That's the first one," he said quietly. "Won't be the last. Whitfield's not a man who gives up easy, and neither is his pride." "I know," Maria whispered. "Believe me, I know exactly what kind of man he is." That evening, once the sun had gone down, and the last of the search parties had returned to town empty-handed and irritable, Owen Mercer closed up the smithy for the night, sliding the heavy bar across the double doors for only the second time in recent memory, the first having been the night his father died 3 years past. He led Maria through the back room and up a narrow ladder to a loft above the forge, a space he used mostly for storing extra iron stock and coal, but which held, in one corner, a small window that looked out over the rooftops of Willow Creek toward the distant purple line of the mountains. "You can sleep up here tonight," he said, laying out a bedroll he had fetched from his own cabin supplies. "Tomorrow we will figure out something better. But it's warm, and nobody's going to think to look for a runaway bride in a blacksmith's loft." Maria sat down slowly on the bedroll, pulling her knees up to her chest, the boy's clothes still strange and ill-fitting against her frame. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "I do not know how to thank you for this. You have risked your business, perhaps even your safety, for a woman you met only hours ago." Owen paused at the top of the ladder, one hand braced against the frame, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read in the dim lantern light. "The name's Owen," he said, "and you don't owe me thanks yet. Wait until we get you clear of this town safely. Then you can thank me." He climbed down the ladder, leaving her alone with the soft glow of a single candle and the distant sound of the town settling into its evening quiet. And Maria Grayson, for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to cry, not from fear this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. The days that followed took on a rhythm neither of them had expected, though both, in their own private ways, came to treasure it. Maria rose before dawn each morning, dressed in her borrowed boy's clothes, and climbed down from the loft to help Owen with the morning chores before the town truly woke. She learned to pump the bellows properly, to sort the different grades of iron stock, to fetch water from the well behind the shop without drawing suspicion from the neighbors. "You have a good hand for this," Owen told her one morning, watching as she carefully arranged a row of nails by size, something his previous apprentice had never managed to do without confusing half of them. "My father always said I had a talent for organizing things that other people found tedious," Maria said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time since her arrival. "He said it would serve me well as a wife, keeping house and ledgers. I do not think he imagined it would serve me well hiding from the very marriage he arranged." There was a bitterness in her voice that Owen recognized, the particular ache of a daughter who loved her father, and yet could not forgive him, not fully, not yet. He set down the length of iron he had been examining and leaned against the workbench, studying her. "Tell me about him," Owen said. "Your father. What happened exactly that it came to this?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling over the nails. "He was not always like this," she said finally. "When my mother was alive, he was a good man, careful with money, careful with us. But after she passed, 3 years ago now, something in him broke. He started going to the saloons more, playing cards with men he should have known better than to trust. Silas Whitfield was the worst of them, always ready to extend credit, always smiling while he did it, until my father owed him more than the ranch was worth twice over. And Whitfield offered to forgive the debt," Owen said slowly, "in exchange for you." "He called it a merger," Maria said, and her voice shook with the memory of it, the humiliation of sitting in Whitfield's parlor while the man discussed her hand in marriage the way he might discuss the purchase of a horse. "As though I were a piece of property to be traded to settle accounts. My father wept when he told me, said he had no other choice, that Whitfield would take the ranch and leave us with nothing if I refused. So I agreed. For 3 months I told myself I could survive it, that a marriage was a marriage no matter how it began, and that perhaps in time I might find some peace within it. And then," Maria looked up at him, and there was something fierce burning behind the fear in her dark eyes. "And then I stood at that altar this morning and looked at that man's face, and I knew, with everything in me, that I would rather die poor and free than live wealthy and owned. So I ran." Owen said nothing for a long moment, only reached across the workbench and covered her hand with his own, a gesture that surprised them both with its gentleness. "You did right," he said quietly. "Whatever happens from here, you did right." It was on the 4th day that Jed Calloway rode into town, dust-covered and grinning beneath a mustache that had seen better decades, his lariat coiled at his saddle, and a reputation as the best cowboy in 3 counties trailing behind him like smoke. He was an old friend of Owen's, the two of them having grown up together on neighboring homesteads before Owen had taken up his father's trade, and Jed had drifted toward ranch work, following the cattle drives up from Texas each spring. He found Owen out back of the smithy, feeding the fire, and clapped him on the shoulder with the easy familiarity of long friendship. "Heard the whole town still buzzing about that runaway bride," Jed said, settling onto an overturned crate. "Whitfield's offering a reward now, $50 to whoever finds her and brings her back. Man's madder than a scalded cat." Owen kept his eyes on the fire, careful to betray nothing in his expression, though his heart had begun to pound at the mention of the reward. $50 was a fortune to most folks in Willow Creek, enough to tempt even honest men into looking a little harder than they otherwise might. "That's so," Owen said carefully. Jed studied his friend for a long moment, his easy grin fading into something more thoughtful. He had known Owen Mercer since they were boys chasing jackrabbits across the prairie, and he knew, better than most, when Owen was hiding something. "Owen," Jed said slowly, "you look like a man holding a secret he ain't sure he can carry alone." For a moment, Owen considered denying it, but he trusted Jed Calloway the way he trusted few other men in this world. And secrets, he was learning, had a way of growing heavier the longer they were carried in silence. He glanced toward the ladder leading to the loft, then back at his friend and made his decision. "Come inside," Owen said. "There's something you ought to know, and I need to know I can trust you with it." Maria's heart nearly stopped when Owen climbed the ladder that afternoon with another man trailing behind him, but Owen raised a calming hand before she could bolt for the small window in the loft's far corner. "This is Jed Calloway," Owen said. "Known him since we were boys stealing peaches from old man Turner's orchard. He's not going to say a word to anybody, are you, Jed?" Jed removed his hat, revealing a shock of sandy hair, and offered Maria a bow that was almost courtly despite the dust still clinging to his boots. "Ma'am," he said, "heard a lot about your predicament these past few days, though I did not know I was hearing about the woman herself sitting right here in my old friend's loft. You have my word on my mother's grave that Silas Whitfield will hear nothing from me." Maria studied him carefully, searching his weathered face for any sign of deception, and found none. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said finally. "Jed," he corrected, settling onto an overturned crate near the window. "And it's no trouble at all, ma'am. Truth be told, I never did care much for Whitfield myself. Man cheated me out of a fair price on a string of horses last autumn, and I've had half a mind to see him get what's coming to him ever since." Over the following days, Jed Calloway became an unexpected but invaluable ally in their careful conspiracy. He brought news from around town, subtle updates on the search efforts, which roads Whitfield's men were watching most closely, which of the townsfolk had begun to grow suspicious of Owen Mercer's sudden reluctance to leave his own shop unattended. He brought supplies too, purchased under the guise of his own needs, so that no one would think it strange that the blacksmith suddenly required twice the usual amount of flour and bacon. "You're a good friend, Jed," Owen told him one evening, as the three of them shared a quiet supper in the back room of the smithy, the shutters drawn tight against prying eyes. "Good friends are worth more than gold in a town like this," Jed said, tearing off a piece of bread. "Besides, watching Whitfield's men chase their own tails looking for a bride that's been right under their noses this whole time is about the finest entertainment I've had all year." Maria laughed, a real laugh, the first she had allowed herself since the day of her almost wedding, and Owen found himself watching her with an expression that Jed did not fail to notice, though he had the good sense to say nothing of it, at least not yet. It was during those quiet evenings, sharing simple meals in the lamplight, that Maria and Owen truly began to know one another beyond the desperate circumstances that had thrown them together. Owen told her of his father, a blacksmith before him, who had taught him the trade with patient hands and few words, and who had died 3 years past from a fever that swept through the town during a particularly harsh winter. He told her of his mother, gone even longer, and of the years he had spent alone in the cabin outside of town, working the forge from dawn until dusk with no company but the ring of hammer on iron. "Have you never wanted a family of your own?" Maria asked one evening, as they sat together near the loft window, watching the stars emerge over the darkened rooftops of Willow Creek. Owen was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over the way he turned over a piece of iron before deciding how to shape it. "I always thought I would," he said finally, "but the right woman never seemed to come along, or if she did, I was too much a coward to say anything about it." Blacksmithing keeps a man's hands busy, but his heart can grow just as lonely as anyone else's. "I find that hard to believe," Maria said softly, "that you would be too much a coward for anything. You took in a runaway bride without a moment's hesitation, knowing full well the risk to yourself." "That's different," Owen said, though a faint flush colored his cheeks beneath the cold dust that never seemed to fully wash away. That was doing right by someone in trouble. Courting a woman is an entirely different sort of bravery. Maria turned to look at him then, and something passed between them in the quiet darkness of the loft, something neither of them was quite ready to name but which both of them felt, unmistakably, settling into their chests like a warmth that had nothing to do with the forge fire below. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "you are braver than you give yourself credit for." Owen did not answer, but he did not look away from her either, and for a long moment the only sound in the loft was the distant call of a nighthawk somewhere over the darkened prairie. It was nearly 2 weeks after Maria's arrival that the first real trouble came knocking, and it came in the form of Silas Whitfield himself, striding into the smithy on a bright, cloudless morning, with 2 of his hired men trailing behind him like a pair of sullen shadows. Maria was in the back room at the time, sorting through a delivery of coal that had arrived from the railway depot, and she froze the instant she heard his voice through the thin wall, that same smooth, oily tone that had haunted her nightmares for the better part of a month. "Mercer," Whitfield said, his boots clicking against the packed dirt floor of the forge. "I need my horse shod. The gray gelding. Should have been done a week ago." "Been busy," Owen said evenly, not looking up from the wheel rim he was repairing. "Bring him around back and I'll get to him this afternoon." Whitfield did not move toward the door. Instead, he wandered further into the shop, his sharp eyes scanning the walls, the tools, the stacks of iron stock, with the particular attentiveness of a man who missed very little. "Heard you took on a new hand," he said casually. "Young fellow, keeps mostly out of sight. My men mentioned seeing him fetching water from the well a few times, always in a hurry, never says much." Maria's heart pounded so violently she was certain the sound of it must be audible through the wall. She pressed herself flat against the shelving unit, praying the shadows would be enough to conceal her. "Boy's shy," Owen said, still not looking up. "Lost his family to fever last winter up near Cheyenne. Doesn't talk much on account of it. Does good work, though." "Is that so?" Whitfield's voice carried a thoughtful edge that made the hairs on the back of Maria's neck stand on end. "I would like to meet him. Perhaps he has seen something useful. My fiancée has been missing for near 2 weeks now, and I intend to find her, one way or another." There was a long pause, and Maria could hear the tension crackling in the air even through the wall. When Owen spoke again, his voice had taken on a harder edge than she had ever heard from him. "She's not your fiancée," he said quietly. "Not anymore. A woman who runs from her own wedding isn't agreeing to anything, Whitfield. She's telling you in about the clearest way a person can that she wants no part of you." Whitfield's laugh was short and cold. "You're awfully invested in the opinions of a woman you claim not to have seen, Mercer. Careful. A man could start to wonder why." "Careful yourself," Owen said. "This is my shop. You want your horse shod, bring him around back. Otherwise, I've got work to do." There was a long, tense silence, and then the sound of boots retreating, the bell above the door jangling as Whitfield and his men departed. Only when the sound of their horses had faded down the street did Maria dare to emerge from the back room, her face pale and her hands trembling. "He suspects," she whispered. "He knows something is not right." Owen set down his tools, his expression grim. "He suspects," he agreed. "But suspecting and knowing are 2 different things. We just need to be more careful. No more fetching water in daylight. No more chores that put you near the street." "And if that is not enough?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Owen, if he finds me here, he will not stop at simply taking me back. My father's debt, the ranch, everything depends on this marriage in his eyes. He will not let it go easily, and he certainly will not forgive you for hiding me." Owen crossed the small distance between them and took both her hands in his grip firm and steady despite the worry etched into his features. "Then we will make sure he does not find you," he said. "I promise you that, Maria, whatever it takes." It was the first time he had used her true name since the day she arrived, and something about hearing it spoken aloud, softly, without fear, settled something deep within her chest that had been unsettled for weeks. That night, unable to sleep, Maria climbed down from the loft to find Owen still awake in the forge, banking the fire for the evening, his movements slow and thoughtful in the flickering orange light. "You should be resting," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "So should you," he replied, though he did not send her back up the ladder. Instead, he gestured toward the low bench near the wall, and she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Owen," she said after a long moment, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. All right, why did you truly help me that first day? You could have turned me over to Sheriff Hartley the moment I appeared. You could have collected whatever goodwill it might have earned you with a man like Whitfield. Instead, you risked everything for a stranger. I want to understand why." Owen was quiet for a long time, staring into the banked embers of the forge fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an honesty that surprised them both. "My mother," he said, "was married off young back in Missouri before my father ever came into the picture. Married to a man twice her age who her own father owed money to, not unlike your situation. She never spoke of it much, but I know it left something broken in her that never quite healed, even after she escaped that marriage and found my father years later. When I saw you running through that door, covered in dust and fear, I saw her. I saw every woman who has ever been treated like a debt to be settled rather than a person to be loved. I could not turn you away. It was never even a question." Maria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she reached for his hand without quite meaning to, lacing her fingers through his rough, calloused ones. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for hiding me, for seeing me as something more than a debt to be settled." Owen turned to look at her then, and in the dim glow of the dying fire, he studied her face as though committing every detail of it to memory. "Maria," he said softly, "I know this is not the time, not with everything hanging over us as it is, but I need you to know that these past 2 weeks have been the finest of my life, difficult as they have been. Having you here, learning your laugh, your stubbornness, the way you sort nails smaller than you need to keep your hands busy when you're thinking hard about something. I did not expect this. I did not go looking for it, but I would be lying if I said I have not fallen for you, Maria Grayson." Maria's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment neither of them moved, the only sound between them the soft crackle of the embers and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere out on the darkened prairie. "I have fallen for you as well," she whispered finally. "I think I have known it for days now, though I was too frightened of what it might mean to say it aloud. Everything in my life these past months has been about survival, about escaping one fate or another. I did not think there was room in my heart for anything as gentle as this." Owen reached up and brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, his touch tender despite the roughness of his hands. "There is room," he said quietly. "There is room enough, I think, for both of us." He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wished it, and when their lips finally met, it was soft and searching, filled with all the tenderness that circumstance had denied them the luxury of expressing until now. Maria's hand curled against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, and for the first time since she had fled her own wedding, she felt something other than fear settle into her bones. She felt impossibly safe. They broke apart slowly, both of them a little breathless, and Owen rested his forehead against hers, his hand cradling the side of her face. "I know we cannot make any promises," he said softly. "Not with Whitfield still hunting for you, not with your father's debt still hanging over your family. But I want you to know that whatever happens, I intend to see this through with you, whatever it takes to keep you safe and free." "I believe you," Maria whispered, and she did, with a certainty that surprised her, given how little certainty she had been afforded in her life these past months. It was 3 days later that everything very nearly fell apart. Jed Calloway arrived at the smithy at first light, his horse lathered from a hard ride, his face pale beneath its usual weathered tan. Owen met him at the door before he had even finished dismounting, reading the urgency in his friend's posture. "Whitfield's men found the tailor," Jed said, his words coming fast and clipped. "The one who made the wedding dress. Somebody remembered that a bolt of fabric was missing from his shop, same color as what Maria's dress was made from. Whitfield's putting it together that somebody helped her change clothes right quick after she ran, and he's got his men going door to door now, checking every business on the main street for anything out of place." Owen felt his stomach drop. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Jed said grimly. "Maybe an hour if we're lucky." They started at the depot and they're working their way down. "Your shop's got to be next on the list, Owen, seeing as it's right on the main street and everybody knows Whitfield already has his suspicions about you." Maria, who had been listening from the doorway of the back room, felt the blood drain from her face. 2 weeks of careful hiding, of quiet routines and whispered conversations, and now it seemed as though it might all collapse in the span of a single morning. "We need to move her," Owen said, already moving toward the loft ladder. "Somewhere Whitfield's men would never think to check." "Where?" Jed asked. "Every barn, every shed, every root cellar in this town is fair game once Whitfield gets it into his head to search it. Man's got money enough to make half the town cooperate whether they want to or not." Owen paused at the base of the ladder, his mind racing, and then a thought struck him with such clarity that he nearly laughed despite the gravity of the situation. "The church," he said. Maria stared at him. "The church." "Owen, that is the last place anyone would think to hide me, but it is also the first place people would look, given that is where the wedding was meant to take place." "Not the church itself," Owen said. "The old bell tower. Nobody's used it in years, not since the new bell was installed at ground level after the tower started leaning. Reverend Callahan keeps meaning to have it torn down but never gets around to it. It's the one place in this whole town that everybody has forgotten exists." Jed nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And Reverend Callahan," he added, "never did think much of Whitfield. Man refused to take a larger donation from him last Christmas on account of not liking how Whitfield made his money. If anybody in this town would help hide Maria out of pure spite toward Whitfield, it would be the Reverend." There was no time to waste. Owen quickly gathered Maria's few belongings, the boy's clothes she had been wearing rolled into a small bundle, while Jed slipped out to ready his horse for a fast, quiet ride to the church situated at the far end of town. Maria's hands shook as she climbed down from the loft one final time, uncertain whether she was moving toward safety or simply trading one hiding place for another, equally precarious. "It will be all right," Owen said, steadying her with a hand at her elbow as they moved through the back alley behind the smithy, keeping close to the shadows of the buildings. "I promise you, Maria, we are not out of options yet." They reached the church just as Reverend Callahan was finishing his morning prayers, an elderly man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair that stood up in unruly tufts no matter how often he tried to smooth it down. He listened to Owen's hurried explanation with a growing frown, and when Owen finished, the Reverend was already moving toward a small door at the base of the bell tower. "Whitfield," the Reverend muttered, shaking his head. "Man tried to buy his way into a front pew last month like the Lord's house was for sale to the highest bidder. I will not have him tearing apart my church looking for a woman who wants nothing more than her own freedom. Go on, child, up you go. Mind the third step, it is loose and liable to give you a scare." Maria climbed the narrow, dusty staircase into the old bell tower, Owen close behind her, and found herself in a small, cramped space beneath the tower's peaked roof, dust-covered but dry, with narrow, slatted windows that let in thin strips of morning light. It was cramped and close, smelling of old wood and pigeon droppings, but it was hidden, and in that moment hidden was all that mattered. "I will come back for you once Whitfield's men have finished their search," Owen said, cupping her face in his hands one final time. "Stay quiet, stay low, and trust that this will be over soon." "Owen," Maria said, catching his wrist before he could turn away. "Be careful. If Whitfield suspects you have been hiding me, there is no telling what he might do. I have survived worse than Silas Whitfield's temper, Owen said, though his attempt at reassurance did little to ease the worry etched into Maria's features. He pressed one final kiss to her forehead before descending the narrow staircase, leaving her alone in the dusty quiet of the old bell tower with only the soft coo of pigeons and the distant sounds of the town below for company. The search, when it came, was every bit as thorough and unpleasant as Jed had warned. Silas Whitfield himself led the effort, moving from building to building with a cold, methodical determination that unsettled even the townsfolk who had no particular love for Maria Grayson or her family. He tore through the mercantile, overturning barrels and crates, ignored the protests of the shopkeeper entirely. He searched the livery stable from top to bottom, even climbing into the hayloft himself, despite his fine tailored suit becoming thoroughly disheveled in the process. When he finally arrived at the smithy, Owen was waiting for him, standing calmly beside his anvil as though he had nothing whatsoever to hide. "Search all you like," Owen said, gesturing toward the open shop. "Won't find anything here but iron and coal." Whitfield's eyes were hard and calculating as he moved through the shop, checking behind stacked lumber, peering into the small back room, even climbing the ladder to the loft above the forge, where he found nothing but neatly stacked iron stock and an empty bedroll that Owen had thankfully thought to remove any trace of Maria's belongings from earlier that morning. "Nothing," Whitfield said finally, descending the ladder with an expression of barely contained frustration. "Curious, Mercer. My men tell me they have not seen your new hired boy in nearly 2 days now." "Boy's been sick," Owen said evenly. "Fever. Sent him out to stay with a family on the edge of town so he wouldn't spread it to the customers." "Which family?" "The Hendersons," Owen said, the lie coming smooth and practiced, though his heart pounded fiercely beneath his calm exterior. He had, in fact, spoken briefly with old Ezra Henderson 2 days prior, ensuring the elderly rancher would corroborate the story should anyone come asking, in exchange for a favor mending his plow the following week. Whitfield studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but unable to find any actual evidence to contradict the story. "You understand," he said slowly, "that harboring a runaway bride is a serious matter. There are debts owed, contracts understood between families. If I discover that anyone in this town has been assisting Maria Grayson in evading her rightful obligations, I will see to it that they regret the decision most severely." "Sounds like quite a threat," Owen said, meeting the other man's gaze steadily. "For a woman who never signed a single paper agreeing to marry you. Last I checked, Whitfield, a woman cannot be bought and sold like a head of cattle, whatever debts her father might owe you. That's not how the law works, not even out here." Something dangerous flickered across Whitfield's face, a flash of temper quickly suppressed beneath his usual careful composure. "The law," he said coldly, "has a way of favoring those with money enough to shape it in their favor. Remember that, Mercer, before you decide to make an enemy of me." He turned and stalked out of the shop, his men trailing behind him, and Owen did not allow himself to breathe easily until the sound of their horses had faded entirely down the main street. It took nearly the entire day for Whitfield's search to finally exhaust itself, the man and his hired riders having torn through nearly every building in Willow Creek, without finding so much as a trace of the woman they sought. By the time evening fell, painting the sky over the distant mountains in shades of orange and violet, Owen made his way carefully back to the church, where Reverend Callahan met him at the door with a knowing nod. "Nobody thought to check the bell tower," the Reverend said, a satisfied smile creasing his weathered face. Whitfield's man did poke his head into the church itself, looking behind the pews like he expected to find her curled up beneath one, but nobody so much as glanced toward the tower stairs. Owen climbed the narrow staircase to find Maria exactly where he had left her, curled against the wall with her knees drawn up to her chest, though relief flooded her features the moment she saw him. "It is over," she asked. "For now." "For now," Owen confirmed, helping her to her feet. Whitfield's given up the search for today at least, but Maria, this cannot continue indefinitely. Sooner or later, he will find you, or he will simply decide to make my life difficult enough that I have no choice but to give you up. We need another plan." Maria was quiet for a long moment as they descended the stairs together, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a new resolve that had not been there before. "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time to stop hiding and start fighting instead." 2 days later, Maria Grayson walked into Sheriff Boone Hartley's office in broad daylight, her head held high despite the fear still coiled tight in her stomach. Owen walked beside her, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, and Jed Calloway trailed behind them both, having insisted on coming along as a witness to whatever might unfold. Sheriff Hartley looked up from his desk with an expression of pure astonishment as the missing bride of Willow Creek walked calmly through his office door. "Well," he said slowly, setting down his pen, "I suppose I owe somebody an explanation as to how I managed to search this entire town twice over and still missed you." "I would like to file a complaint, Sheriff," Maria said, her voice steady despite the tremor she could feel in her own hands. "Against Silas Whitfield." Hartley leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to continue, and Maria explained everything: the debt her father owed, the coerced agreement to marry a man she had never wished to marry, the threats Whitfield had made toward Owen and anyone else who might have helped her. She spoke of the desperation that had driven her to flee her own wedding, and the 2 weeks she had spent hiding in fear of a man who believed he could purchase a wife the same way he might purchase a parcel of land. When she finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face troubled. "I will be honest with you, Miss Grayson," he said finally. "There is no law in this territory, nor in any territory I am aware of, that recognizes a marriage contract negotiated in exchange for debt forgiveness. Whatever agreement your father made with Whitfield, it holds no weight in a court of law regarding your hand in marriage. You were never legally obligated to marry that man, whatever pressure was placed upon you." Maria felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear and uncertainty she had carried for months finally beginning to unwind. "Then I am free," she whispered, "truly free." "You were always free," Hartley said gently, "though I understand why it might not have felt that way, given the circumstances. As for your father's debt, that is a separate matter entirely, a legitimate financial obligation, but it has nothing whatsoever to do with your marriage. Whitfield conflated the two matters to suit his own purposes, and frankly, Miss Grayson, that borders on fraud in my estimation." "What about the reward he's offered?" Jed spoke up from near the doorway. $50 to whoever brought her back. Half the town's been looking for her on account of that money." "The reward is void," Hartley said firmly. "There is no crime in a grown woman declining to marry a man, regardless of what debts her family might owe him. If Whitfield wishes to collect on that debt, he can pursue it through proper legal channels against her father's estate, not by hunting down an unwilling bride like she's a stray head of cattle." It was not the end of their troubles, not entirely, but it was the first real crack of light Maria had seen in months, and she felt tears of relief prick at her eyes as Owen's hand found hers, squeezing gently. The confrontation with Silas Whitfield, when it finally came, unfolded not in some dramatic showdown in the street, but in the sheriff's own office, where Hartley summoned him the following morning to explain the true nature of the law regarding marriage contracts and debt. Whitfield arrived furious, his face flushed with anger as he took in the sight of Maria standing beside Owen Mercer, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. "This is absurd," Whitfield snapped, rounding on the sheriff. "The girl's father agreed to the terms. There was an understanding between us." "An understanding is not a legal contract, Whitfield," Hartley said calmly. "And even if it were, you cannot force a woman into marriage against her will in this territory, not by threat, not by financial pressure, not by any means whatsoever. If you wish to collect on Thomas Grayson's debt, you are welcome to pursue him through the courts regarding the ranch and his other assets." But Maria Grayson is not and never was a debt to be collected. Whitfield's eyes flicked toward Maria, then toward Owen, and something ugly twisted across his features. "You," he said, jabbing a finger toward Owen. "You have been hiding her this entire time, haven't you, right under everyone's nose?" "I have," Owen said, meeting the other man's furious gaze without flinching. "And I would do it again without a moment's hesitation." "You will regret this, Mercer," Whitfield hissed. "I will see to it that no rancher within 50 miles brings their business to your shop ever again. I will ruin you." "Perhaps," Owen said calmly. "Or perhaps the folks of this town will remember that you tried to buy yourself a wife with another man's debt, and decide for themselves what kind of man deserves their business. I reckon most decent people would rather do business with an honest blacksmith than a man who thinks he can purchase a bride like a side of beef." Sheriff Hartley cleared his throat pointedly. "Whitfield, I would suggest you consider very carefully what you say and do next. There are witnesses in this room, myself included, and I would be more than happy to look further into exactly how you have been conducting your business dealings in this town if you continue making threats." Something in the sheriff's tone finally seemed to penetrate Whitfield's fury, a warning that his own affairs might not survive close scrutiny either. He straightened his jacket with sharp, angry movements, cast one final venomous look toward Maria and Owen, and stormed out of the office without another word, his boots echoing furiously against the wooden boardwalk outside. It was, in the end, a quieter victory than Maria had imagined during all those long nights hiding in fear, but it was a victory nonetheless. And as she stood there in the sheriff's office with Owen's hand warm and steady in hers, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her future belonged entirely to herself. The matter of her father's debt remained, however, a shadow that still hung over the Grayson family despite Maria's newfound freedom from her forced engagement. She rode out to her father's ranch 2 days later, Owen accompanying her at her request, both of them uncertain what reception awaited them. Thomas Grayson met them at the door of the modest ranch house, looking older and more haggard than Maria remembered, deep lines etched into a face that had once been quick to smile. When he saw his daughter standing there, alive and well despite weeks of uncertainty about her fate, something in his expression crumbled entirely, and he pulled her into an embrace that spoke of relief too great for words. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered against her hair. "I thought perhaps you had run off into the wilderness and come to some terrible end, and it would have been my fault entirely for putting you in that position." "I am here, Papa," Maria said, her own eyes wet with tears. "I am here and I am safe, thanks to Owen." Thomas Grayson looked toward Owen Mercer, taking in the blacksmith's steady presence, the protective way he stood near Maria, and something like understanding dawned across his weathered features. "You are the one who has been hiding her," he said. "The whole town's searching, and she was right there in the middle of it the entire time." "Yes, sir," Owen said. "And I would like your permission, if you are willing to give it, to court your daughter properly, once matters here are settled." Thomas Grayson studied the younger man for a long moment, then looked toward Maria, seeing in her eyes something he had not seen in longer than he cared to admit, a genuine happiness that had nothing to do with fear or obligation. "I owe you an apology, daughter," he said quietly. "I let my own foolishness with cards and drink put you in a position no father should ever place his child in. I cannot undo what has already happened, but I can promise you this. I will never again make a decision regarding your future without your full and willing consent, whatever debts I might owe." "What will happen to the ranch, Papa?" Maria asked. "Whitfield still holds your notes, does he not?" Thomas nodded grimly. "He does, though the sheriff informs me the debt is legitimate. Whatever else Whitfield attempted regarding your hand in marriage, I will likely lose the ranch in time. It is no less than I deserve, I suppose, for the foolishness that brought us to this point." Owen was quiet for a moment, considering something carefully before speaking. "Mr. Grayson," he said, "I have some savings put aside from years of work at the forge. Not enough to cover the full debt, I imagine, but perhaps enough to negotiate better terms with Whitfield, or to buy time enough to sell off a portion of the herd at fair market price, rather than losing everything at once to a man determined to see you ruined out of spite. Maria stared at Owen in astonishment. Owen, you cannot possibly mean to spend your savings on my father's debts. That money was meant for your own future, for expanding the smithy, for building a proper house someday. My future, Owen said, turning to look at her with a warmth that made her breath catch, is standing right in front of me, Maria. If helping your father means we build that future a little more slowly, then I consider it money well spent. It took several weeks of careful negotiation, with Sheriff Hartley serving as an unofficial mediator and several other ranchers in the area, having grown weary of Whitfield's reputation for predatory lending, offering to purchase portions of the Grayson herd at fair prices to help settle the debt more quickly. In the end, Thomas Grayson lost a significant portion of his land, enough to satisfy Whitfield's claim without leaving the family entirely destitute, retaining a modest homestead and enough cattle to rebuild slowly, honestly, without the shadow of predatory debt hanging over every decision. Silas Whitfield, for his part, found himself increasingly isolated in the weeks that followed, as word spread through Willow Creek and the surrounding ranches of exactly how he had attempted to use Thomas Grayson's debt to coerce a young woman into marriage. Several of his other business dealings came under closer scrutiny as a result, and within the year, he had sold his remaining holdings in the territory and moved on to seek his fortune elsewhere, leaving Willow Creek considerably relieved by his absence. It was on a warm afternoon in early autumn, nearly 5 months after Maria Grayson had first stumbled into his blacksmith shop in a torn wedding dress, that Owen Mercer knelt on one knee beside the very anvil where he had been working the day she arrived, and asked her to marry him properly, this time as a woman choosing her own future rather than one forced upon her by circumstance. Maria Grayson, he said, his voice steady despite the nervous pounding of his heart, I have loved you since the moment I found you hiding behind that scrap barrel, though I did not have the words for it then. I have watched you find your courage again these past months, watched you fight for your own freedom and your father's future, and I cannot imagine spending the rest of my days with anyone but you. Will you marry me? Not because of debt, not because of obligation, but because I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world. Maria, tears streaming freely down her face, sank to her knees beside him, cupping his soot-stained face in her hands. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Owen Mercer, I will marry you, and I will consider myself the most fortunate woman in all of Colorado Territory to do so. They were married the following spring, in the very church whose bell tower had once hidden Maria from the man who would have made her a prisoner in her own life. Reverend Callahan officiated the ceremony with evident satisfaction, having played no small part in the events that had led them to this moment. Thomas Grayson walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, finally able to give her away not as a debt settled, but as a gift freely offered to a man who had proven himself worthy of her love 100 times over. Jed Calloway stood as Owen's best man, grinning throughout the entire ceremony as though he personally took credit for the match, which, given his role in their courtship, he was not entirely wrong to claim. Half the town of Willow Creek turned out for the celebration afterward, held in the yard behind the smithy, with tables of food contributed by neighbors who had come to admire the quiet courage of the blacksmith and his bride. To think, Sheriff Hartley said, raising a glass during the toasts that followed, that I searched this entire town twice over looking for a runaway bride, and she was hiding right there in the last place any of us thought to look properly, right under our very noses the whole time. Perhaps there is a lesson in that for all of us, about how the things we search hardest for are sometimes closer than we ever imagined. The years that followed were not without their hardships, as life in the Colorado Territory rarely offered comfort without cost. There were harsh winters that tested the strength of the smithy's modest profits, and seasons when cattle prices fell low enough that even Thomas Grayson's rebuilding efforts faltered. But Owen and Maria faced each hardship together, their partnership growing stronger with each trial, much the way iron grew stronger through repeated tempering in the forge fire. Maria proved herself a natural partner in the business, her sharp mind for organization and ledgers, honed from years of managing her father's household accounts, transforming the modest blacksmith shop into a thriving enterprise that supplied not only Willow Creek, but several of the surrounding ranches with quality ironwork and farrier services. Within 3 years, they had expanded the shop, hired a proper apprentice to replace the fictional sick boy who had once served as Maria's cover story, and built a comfortable house on a small parcel of land just outside of town, close enough to the smithy for convenience, but far enough to enjoy a measure of peaceful privacy. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Maria's father, arrived in the autumn of 1880, squalling and healthy, with his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Owen held the boy for the first time with hands that trembled despite years of steady work at the forge, and Maria watched from the bed, exhausted but radiant, as her husband wept openly for the first time since she had known him. "He is perfect," Owen whispered, cradling the infant against his chest. "Perfect and strong, just like his mother." 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Elizabeth after Owen's own mother, a bright and curious child who took to following her older brother around the smithy yard almost as soon as she could walk, fascinated by the ring of hammer against iron in a way that made Owen laugh and remark that perhaps she would grow to be a blacksmith herself someday, an idea Maria found she rather liked. Given how the world's expectations of women had so nearly ruined her own life before Owen had offered her shelter, and eventually, his heart. Thomas Grayson, for his part, found new purpose in his later years as a doting grandfather, riding into town regularly to visit his grandchildren and to help Owen with the heavier work around the smithy on days when his old joints allowed for it. He never fully forgave himself for the circumstances that had once nearly cost his daughter her freedom and happiness, but he found a measure of peace in watching her thrive, in seeing the love that had grown between her and Owen deepen with each passing season. Jed Calloway remained a fixture in their lives as well, eventually settling down himself with a schoolteacher from the neighboring town of Fort Collins, though he never tired of telling the story of how he had helped hide the most wanted bride in Colorado territory right under the nose of the entire town, embellishing the tale a little more with each retelling, until Owen and Maria's children grew up believing their Uncle Jed had personally outwitted a dozen armed men, rather than simply bringing supplies and news during those tense early weeks. On quiet evenings, long after the children had been put to bed and the forge fire had been banked for the night, Owen and Maria often sat together on the porch of their modest home, watching the stars emerge over the distant mountains much as they had once watched them from the small window of the loft above the smithy, all those years ago when their future together had seemed as uncertain as it was precious. "Do you ever think about that day?" Maria asked one such evening, resting her head against Owen's shoulder as the last light faded from the western sky. "The day I ran through your doors in that ruined wedding dress." "Often," Owen admitted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I even truly had you. If Whitfield's men had searched the smithy first, if I had hesitated even a moment before hiding you, everything might have turned out so differently." "But it did not," Maria said softly. "You found the courage when it mattered most, and so did I. Perhaps that is the truest lesson in all of it. Not that we found shelter in an unlikely place, but that we found the courage to fight for a future neither of us dared to imagine before that day." Owen turned to look at her, at the woman who had once been a frightened runaway bride and had become, over the years, his partner, his equal, and the truest love he had ever known. "I would not change a single moment of it," he said quietly. Not the fear, not the danger, not even Whitfield's foolishness, because every part of it led me to you, and to this life we have built together. Nor would I, Maria whispered, and as the stars brightened overhead and the sounds of their sleeping children drifted faintly from the house behind them, she knew, with a certainty that had once seemed impossible during those desperate days of hiding and fear, that she had finally found exactly where she belonged. The town of Willow Creek continued to grow over the years that followed, its dusty main street eventually giving way to proper wooden boardwalks, its population swelling with new families drawn west by the promise of land and opportunity. The Mercer smithy remained a fixture of that growth, passed down eventually to young Thomas Mercer, who took to the trade with the same steady patience his father had shown before him, while Elizabeth Mercer, true to her childhood fascination, became something of a local curiosity herself, one of the few women in the territory known to work iron alongside the men, a fact that made her father burst with pride every time he watched her at the anvil. And on the wall of that smithy, long after Owen and Maria had grown old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew the story of the runaway bride and the blacksmith who had hidden her not as legend, but as simple, cherished family history, there remained a single faded canvas tarp, folded carefully and kept in a place of honor, a quiet reminder of the day when love had found its beginning in the most unlikely, most overlooked corner of an entire town's desperate search. In the last place anyone had thought to look,